Most people are operating at a fraction of their actual capacity, not because they lack opportunity, but because they have fundamentally misread the nature of their own design. You were not assembled randomly. You were engineered with precision, with intent, with a specific function embedded into every layer of your construction. And yet, here you are borrowing someone else's routine, chasing someone else's blueprint, mimicking behaviors that were never calibrated for your specific assignment. That is not ambition, that is confusion, wearing the mask of effort. Let me submit to you, the reason most people cannot build a thriving mindset is not because they lack desire. It is because they have never understood what a mindset actually is at its core. They treat it like a mood, something that changes with the weather, something that rises and falls with circumstance. But a mindset is not a mood. A mindset is a manufacturing position. It is the internal setting from which all output is produced in. When the setting is wrong, everything downstream is compromised. You can work harder, sleep less, consume more content, attend more seminars, and still produce defective results because the factory floor itself is miscalibrated. That is not a motivation problem. That is an architectural problem. You don't need motivation. You need revelation. Motivation is temporary ignition. It gets the engine started, but it does not determine where you go or how efficiently you travel. Revelation is structural. It rewires the internal map. It changes the coordinates from which you operate. When a component in a machine receives the correct signal about its function, it stops wasting energy on tasks it was never designed to perform. It aligns. It produces. It sustains output without constant external prompting. That is what revelation does to a human being who finally understands the laws governing their own design. Most people fail to build a thriving mindset because they treat the process like decoration. They add habits on top of dysfunction the way someone might paint over a cracked wall. The surface looks improved. The structure remains compromised. They journal for 3 days and quit. They meditate for a week and abandon it. They wake up early for 2 weeks and collapse back into a pattern that was never serving them. And they blame their willpower. When the real issue is that they never understood the governing law behind a habit. A habit without understanding is ritual without function, and ritual without function is routine in disguise. The manufacturer does not build anything without first establishing the blueprint IB. Before a single component is assembled, before a single part is manufactured, the intent is documented. The function is established. The tolerances are set. Everything that follows in the production process is governed by what was determined in the design stage. Your daily habits are not accessories. They are maintenance protocols for a system that was already designed with extraordinary precision. And when you ignore the maintenance schedule, you do not just experience inconvenience. You experience systems failure, gradually, then suddenly. The way every machine that is neglected eventually fails. Now receive what follows not as inspiration. Receive it as technical instruction for a system that has been operating below its designated specifications for far too long. The first law is the law of primary input. What enters the system determines what the system produces. This is not philosophy. This is engineering. Every manufacturing system is only as clean as the materials that enter. Introduce contaminated raw material into a precision production line, and you do not get a slightly imperfect product. You get a compromised output at every stage downstream. Your mind operates by this same principle. What you consume in the first 90 minutes of your day sets the processing frequency for everything that follows. Most people begin their day by immediately introducing the most chaotic, unfiltered, algorithmically engineered content available directly into their operating system. news feeds designed to provoke, social timelines engineered to compare, notification systems calibrated to interrupt. And then they wonder why their thinking feels fragmented, why their decisions feel reactive, why their focus lasts for minutes instead of hours. Consider a master craftsman who understood this law intuitively. Every morning before touching a single tool, before speaking to a single customer, before opening the doors of his workshop, he sat in silence for 45 minutes, unquote. Not in any formal practice, simply allowing the system to stabilize before introducing external input. His competitors thought this was inefficiency. They rushed to their benches the moment they arrived. They worked longer hours, they processed more orders, but their rejection rate was 3 times higher than his. And the work that came from his hands commanded 3 times the price, because the product always reflects the condition of the system that produced it, always. The application is precise. The first 45 minutes of your day must be protected from external input, not negotiable, not situational, structural. This window is not for consumption, it is for calibration. Move your body, sit in silence. Write in a governance journal, which is a record not of how you feel, but of what you intend to produce and why. This is primary input management. And it is the foundation upon which every other law rests. The second law is the law of intentional friction. A mindset that has never been tested is not a thriving mindset. It is a comfortable mindset. And comfort left unchallenged is the beginning of atrophy. In manufacturing, control stress testing is not punishment, it is protocol. Before a structural component is trusted with real-world load, it is subjected to forces greater than it will ever encounter in standard operation, not to destroy it, to reveal its actual tolerance, to expose any weakness before it becomes catastrophic failure under real conditions. The human system is no different. When you deliberately introduce difficulty into your daily structure, you are not punishing yourself. You are conducting tolerance testing. You are stress testing the component before it needs to perform under genuine pressure. The person who has never trained their body to be uncomfortable will collapse under the first real experience of discomfort. The person who has never trained their mind to remain functional under pressure will deteriorate the moment real pressure arrives. Daily intentional friction is the governance mechanism that ensures your system does not merely function in ideal conditions, but thrives under operational demand. There was a metallurgist who was given an assignment to develop a new alloy for industrial use. The alloy looked perfect under standard observation. The composition was correct. The measurements were exact, but he refused to certify it until it had passed through repeated thermal cycling, being heated to extreme temperatures and cooled rapidly, again and again. His colleagues said the alloy was already sufficient. He said that sufficiency measured in the laboratory means nothing if it fails in the field. When the alloy finally went to production, it was placed in environments that would have destroyed every competing product on the market it held. Because it had been through the cycle, because the friction had been intentional. The application here is that you must build one deliberate difficulty into each day. Not something dangerous, something that requires you to override the impulse to stop, cold exposure. A purposeful fast, a difficult conversation you have been avoiding, a physical threshold pushed beyond what is comfortable, a creative problem worked through without external assistance. The specifics are secondary. The principle is primary. Daily intentional friction is what separates a mind that merely functions from a mind that governs. The third law is the law of governance before reaction. The most dangerous operating mode for the human system is the reactive mode. When external events are allowed to dictate the internal state. The system is no longer operating under its own governance. It is being operated by everything outside it. And nothing outside you was designed with your specific assignment in mind. The news was not calibrated for your purpose. The opinions of others were not structured around your blueprint. The behavior of people who do not understand your function was never designed to serve your design. Governance is the practice of making your internal state a decision rather than a response. This does not mean the absence of emotion. Emotion is data. It is the system's way of signaling that something has occurred that requires processing. But data is not a directive. You process data. You do not obey it blindly. A thermostat receives temperature data and responds automatically. A governance system receives the same data and decides deliberately. There is an enormous difference between those two operating positions. One is automated reaction. The other is intentional dominion. Think about a precision navigation system installed on a vessel in open water. The ocean is unpredictable. Storms arise, currents shift, winds change direction without warning. A ship without a governance system is at the mercy of all of these forces. It goes where the ocean sends it. But a ship with a properly calibrated navigation system receives all of that same environmental data and makes continuous adjustments that keep the vessel on the predetermined course. The ocean does not stop being turbulent. The ship does not stop being affected. But the destination does not change because governance is in operation. The daily application of this law requires what I call a constitutional review. Every morning, before you engage with the external environment, you review your governing values, your primary commitments, and the specific function you are assigned to execute that day. This takes 7 minutes. No more is required. But those 7 minutes install the governance framework through which every subsequent event of the day will be filtered. Without this installation, the day installs its own framework, and the day's framework is chaos. The fourth law is the law of specific output. The human system was not built for vague intent. Vague intent produces vague results. And vague results produce the peculiar frustration of someone who worked hard and still cannot account for where the effort went. Manufacturing systems do not operate on general goals. They operate on specific tolerances, specific quantities, specific quality standards, specific delivery windows. Precision is not perfectionism. Precision is the condition under which design becomes reality. Most people approach their days the way someone might wander through a warehouse with no inventory list. They move, they handle things, they feel productive. But at the end of the day, they cannot tell you what was actually produced. They were busy. They were not manufacturing. Busy is motion. Manufacturing is output measured against specification. And a thriving mindset is one that has learned to operate under specification rather than under the illusion of activity. A logistics engineer once described what she called the difference between movement and throughput. Movement is packages shifting around the floor. Throughput is packages reaching their destination at the designated time. She said that in every facility she assessed, the busiest looking operations were often the ones with the lowest throughput, because movement without direction is an organized version of chaos. She redesigned the workflow of every operation she managed around one core question: what specifically must exit this facility today? Not what can we attempt, not what would be ideal. What specifically must be produced and verified as complete? The application of this law requires that before you begin any day of work, you identify the 3 outputs that must be produced for that day to be classified as functional. Not 10 items, not a list that could not be completed by a team of 4. 3 specific measurable outputs. This practice alone restructures the entire relationship between a person and their time. Because when the day ends, there is no ambiguity. Either the output exists or it does not. Either the function was executed or it was not. That clarity is not pressure. That clarity is governance in its most applied form. The 5th law is the law of metabolic recovery. The operating culture of this era has romanticized exhaustion. Fatigue has been dressed up as dedication. Sleep deprivation has been framed as sacrifice for success. And an entire generation of high-functioning people has driven their systems into chronic degradation while calling it ambition. Let me submit to you, a machine that is never allowed to complete its maintenance cycle does not produce more I. It produces less I. And eventually, it does not produce at all. The manufacturer did not install a recovery system into the human design as a concession to weakness. Recovery is a performance protocol. It is the phase during which the system consolidates what was processed, repairs what was stressed, recalibrates what drifted, and prepares for the next operational cycle. When you interrupt this phase chronically, you are not extracting more performance. You are consuming the system's capital. You are spending the reserves that were allocated for sustained operation, and capital consumed this way cannot be recovered without complete operational shutdown. There is a principle in industrial engineering called maintenance window optimization. The most efficient production systems in the world are not the ones that run the longest without stopping. They are the ones that stop at precisely the right intervals, for precisely the right duration, to execute precisely the right maintenance. Because a system that is maintained correctly produces at a higher rate with fewer defects for a longer operational lifespan than a system pushed past its maintenance thresholds. This is not a metaphor. This is the governing law of every complex system, including the one you are living in. The application here is non-negotiable. 7 to 9 hours of sleep is not a luxury. It is a manufacturing requirement. There must also be at least one 90-minute block of what I call low cognitive activity built into every week. Not consumption of media, not social engagement, something that allows the deeper systems to process what the surface systems have been accumulating. Walking without a destination, sitting near open water, crafting something with your hands. The form is secondary. The function is recovery, and recovery is production, not rest from production. Never confuse those two realities. The 6th law is the law of social architecture. The people you are in regular proximity to are not neutral to your design. They are either calibrating your system toward its intended function, or they are gradually recalibrating it toward a frequency that was never yours. There is no middle ground here. Social proximity is an engineering reality. Every system that operates in close contact with another system is influenced by the frequency, the temperature, and the operating rhythm of the adjacent system. This is not judgment of the people in question. It is an acknowledgement of how systems interact under the laws of proximity. A thriving mindset cannot be sustained in an environment of consistent exposure to systems operating in chronic deficits. Not because those systems have no value, but because deficit is contagious in the same precise way that alignment is contagious. You will begin to match the processing speed of the people you spend the most time with. You will begin to adopt the operating assumptions of those whose voices you hear most consistently. This is not weakness. This is how the human system was designed to function within community. The question is not whether you are being influenced. The question is whether that influence is governing you toward your assignment or systematically pulling you away from it. There was a civil engineer tasked with constructing a precision instrument housing facility. The instruments inside required environments with almost no atmospheric vibration. Everything that functioned around those instruments had to be assessed, not for its individual quality, but for the frequency it introduced into the surrounding system. A perfectly functioning pump was removed not because it was defective, but because the frequency it emitted was incompatible with the environment of the instruments required to function at specification. The pump was excellent. The environment was the governing priority. She understood that architectural decisions are not about individual component quality. They are about systemic compatibility. The application requires an honest structural assessment of your 5 closest regular proximities, not to discard people, to understand what frequencies are currently governing your environment, and to make deliberate architectural decisions about exposure, duration, and depth of engagement. You are not obligated to remain in a social structure that consistently overrides your governance system. You are, however, obligated to take responsibility for the architecture of the environment in which you are attempting to function. Now, let me show you how to build a thriving mindset. Not as a concept, but as a structural installation executed in precise phases with measurable benchmarks at every interval. In the first 72 hours after receiving this information, the assignment is not to overhaul everything simultaneously. The assignment is to audit, take inventory of the 5 inputs that currently dominate your mornings. Identify the 3 people you spend the most time with and assess honestly whether their operating frequency is aligned with the direction of your assignment. Write down the last 7 days and identify how many of those days produce 3 specific measurable outputs versus how many were consumed entirely by reactive motion and vague activity. This audit is not self-condemnation, it is diagnostic. Every effective repair begins with an accurate and unflinching assessment of current system state. Anything less than honesty here is a downstream problem deferred rather than resolved. In the first 30 days, install primary input management into your morning structure. 45 minutes of protected calibration time. Begin the practice of constitutional review, that 7-minute governance installation before external engagement each day. Introduce 1 form of intentional friction daily without negotiating yourself out of it. Begin tracking your outputs by specification rather than by sensation of productivity. And audit your social architecture by identifying which relationships are functioning as alignment structures and which are functioning as frequency interference. Begin to make deliberate adjustments to proximity without announcement and without drama. Quietly restructure the architecture and observe what happens to your system's operating baseline within 30 days. The data will be undeniable. In the 6-month cycle, you will notice something that cannot be manufactured artificially or imported from external sources. Your operating baseline will shift. What once required significant effort will become the natural position of the system. What once felt like exceptional discipline will begin to feel like minimum function. This is not because you have become superhuman. It is because you have allowed the system to recalibrate to its actual design specifications. A machine operating at its intended parameters does not feel like it is working extraordinarily hard. It feels like it is working correctly. And correct operation sustained over 6 months produces output that the previous version of that system could not have imagined or projected. The 7th and final law is the law of compound function. Every governing system produces results not in proportion to individual inputs, but in proportion to the accumulated interaction of all inputs over time. This is the law that makes daily habits more powerful than occasional massive efforts. A single massive effort produces a single output. Daily habits that operate under governing laws produce compound results. The kind of results that are difficult to explain to someone who has not understood the law. Because from the outside, the inputs seem modest and the outputs seem disproportionate. What they are observing is not luck. What they are observing is compound function in its fully matured expression. Think of a structural engineer tasked with designing a bridge to withstand load conditions that exceeded anything previously attempted in that region. She did not design a single massive support structure. She designed a system of interconnected components where each component reinforced every other component. The strength of the system was not the strength of any one part. It was the strength of the relationships between the parts, the compound function of a properly integrated system. When the bridge was tested under maximum load, every observer expected to see the point of failure. There was none, because the system was not dependent on any single component for its integrity. It was an expression of their integration and their mutual reinforcement. Your 7 governing habits function by this same principle. Primary input management reinforces your capacity to practice governance before reaction. Intentional friction strengthens your ability to maintain specific output under genuine pressure. Metabolic recovery increases the quality and depth of your daily calibration work. Social architecture determines the environment in which all other laws either compound or erode. And compound function is what emerges when all preceding laws are operating simultaneously and consistently over time. You do not merely become more productive, you become architecturally different. You become a fundamentally different kind of system than what you were before this understanding entered your operating environment. This is where I must speak directly to the history that some of you carry into this moment. The years that felt wasted, the decisions you would reverse if the architecture of time permitted reversal. The seasons of life that felt like failure, like permanent derailment, like evidence that the system was somehow defective from its original assembly. Let me submit to you the final truth I want you to carry forward with the full weight it deserves. The manufacturer does not waste material. Every test a component is subjected to prior to deployment is part of the production process, not a deviation from it. When a structural component fails under laboratory stress testing, that failure is not evidence that the component is defective beyond repair. It is data. Precise, valuable, irreplaceable data that tells the engineers exactly where to strengthen the design, exactly what tolerances require adjustment, exactly what the component must pass through in order to function at its assigned capacity in its intended environment. The failure is part of the refinement. The difficulty is part of the manufacturing process. And no engineer with real understanding discards a component because it revealed weakness under stress. That revelation is the entire point of the test. What you have interpreted as your failures are stress test results. What you have called your worst seasons were thermal cycling. What you label as evidence of your fundamental deficiency was the manufacturer's process of revealing precisely what required strengthening before you could be trusted with the assignment that was embedded in your design from the beginning. You were not broken. You were being refined. You were not rejected. You were being quality checked. And every component that survives the testing process enters deployment with something that no untested component can possess. Proven tolerance, demonstrated capacity, verified function under real-world, uncontrolled, high-pressure operational conditions. The most extraordinary outputs in any manufacturing process do not originate from components that were never challenged. They come from components that were forged under heat, tested under load, stressed beyond their comfort threshold, refined through failure, and certified through the full process. Your history is your certification, not your shame, not your permanent evidence of inadequacy, your certification. The stamp pressed into the metal of your design that says this component has been through the cycle, has revealed its weaknesses, has been strengthened at each revealed point, and has emerged with its function intact and its capacity verified. That stamp cannot be purchased. It cannot be simulated. It can only be earned through the process you have already survived. So here is the final charge. Not as motivation, as structural revelation. The blueprint for your life already exists. The function was assigned before you had the capacity to understand it. The daily habits are not the goal. They are the maintenance protocols that keep the system aligned with the original design intent. Every morning you choose your primary input. Every day you choose your intentional difficulty. Every interaction is either governance or reaction. Every output is either specific or vague. Every night is either recovery or depletion. Every relationship is either calibrating you toward your function or pulling you away from it. And all of it, every single practice sustained with consistency over time, compounds into something that the untrained observer will call talent, luck, natural gifting, or fortunate timing. You and I know what it actually is. It is a system operating at the specifications it was designed for. Nothing more mysterious than that. Nothing less significant than that. A design executing its intent with precision, consistency, and compound force. That is what a thriving mindset produces when it is properly installed, regularly maintained, and protected from the contamination of borrowed blueprints and foreign frequencies. You were not placed here to imitate someone else's output. You were not assembled from precision components to spend your operational lifespan mimicking a design that was never calibrated for your specific function. AD. The source does not produce duplicates. Every system that has ever been released into this world carries a unique configuration, a singular assignment, a function that cannot be replicated by any other system, regardless of how closely it attempts to copy the external presentation. The world does not need another reproduction of what already exists. The world is waiting for what only your specific configuration can produce. The assignment is yours alone. The blueprint belongs to no other system. The function is irreplaceable, and it is time sensitive in ways you may not have fully calculated. Return to your original design. Install the governing laws. Execute the maintenance protocols without negotiation. Produce the output that was always intended from the moment of your first assembly. And when the full record of your assignment is finally complete, let it show that you understood what you were, operated accordingly with discipline and with dominion, and delivered everything that was placed within you to deliver. Not partially, not eventually, completely. Be original, not a copy.